For decades, Yellowstone National Park was missing something so important that an entire ecosystem began to unravel without it. Rivers changed course, forests struggled to regenerate, animal populations grew out of balance. Scientists watched as one of America's greatest wildernesses slowly transformed in ways few people understood. Then, in the winter of 1995, a small group of wolves crossed into Yellowstone for the first time in nearly 70 years. At first, they seemed insignificant, just a handful of predators returning to a landscape that had long forgotten them. But what happened next stunned researchers, challenged decades of assumptions, and became one of the most extraordinary wildlife stories ever recorded. Among those wolves emerged individuals whose influence would extend far beyond their own packs. Their presence would reshape the behavior of elk, revive forests, create opportunities for countless other species, and help trigger a chain reaction that spread across the entire ecosystem. Scientists expected wolves to hunt prey. What they didn't expect was that the return of a single predator could help transform rivers, forests, birds, beavers, and even the landscape itself. Today, the Yellowstone wolf restoration is considered one of the most remarkable ecological recoveries. But the story isn't just about wolves, it's about how one species disappeared, what happened when it was gone, and how its return changed everything. This is the incredible true story of how one wolf helped change an entire ecosystem. To understand what happened in Yellowstone, we first need to go back to what was lost for thousands of years. Wolves were a natural part of this landscape. They moved through valleys, mountains, and forests in tightly organized packs, keeping prey populations in check and shaping the behavior of other animals. They were not just predators, they were regulators of balance, but by the early 20th century, that balance was broken. Through hunting, trapping, and government eradication programs, wolves were completely removed from Yellowstone by the 1922nd. At the time, it was seen as a victory for ranchers and hunters. Without wolves, elk populations began to grow rapidly. Deer roamed more freely. The park appeared, on the surface, to be safer for herbivores. But nature doesn't simply stay safe when a key species disappears. Without wolves, elk behavior changed dramatically. Instead of moving constantly across the landscape, they began to linger in the same areas for long periods of time. One of the most critical impacts was on young willow, aspen, and cottonwood trees, plants that depend on time and space to regenerate. Over decades, entire riverbanks began to lose vegetation. Streams became more exposed. Erosion increased. The land itself began to change shape, not because of weather alone, but because a single missing predator had altered the system from the top down. By the 1992, Yellowstone was no longer functioning the way it once did. Scientists recognized it as a trophic cascade in progress, a chain reaction caused by the removal of a top predator. This was the world waiting for the return of the wolf. In 1995, Yellowstone was chosen as the site for one of the most ambitious wildlife restoration projects in American history, the reintroduction of gray wolves. After nearly 70 years of absence, wolves were carefully transported from Canada and released into the park. These were not just any animals. They were selected from stable packs, studied by biologists, and relocated under strict conservation programs. The goal was simple in theory, but complex in reality: restore a missing predator and observe what nature would do next. Among these early wolves were individuals that would later become known through research and tracking data: wolves like 9F10M, and members of what would eventually be identified as influential packs, such as the Druid Peak and later the Lamar Canyon lineage. At first, survival was uncertain. Yellowstone was unfamiliar territory. The wolves had to adapt quickly to new prey, new terrain, and a landscape that had not seen their kind for generations. Elk, their primary food source, were strong, fast, and unaccustomed to predation pressure after decades without wolves. But something began to shift almost immediately. Elk behavior started changing. Instead of staying in open valleys and riverbanks for long periods, they became more alert, more mobile, and more cautious. Areas that were once heavily grazed began to show the first signs of recovery as elk moved away more frequently. This behavioral change, though subtle at first, marked the beginning of something much larger than anyone had fully predicted. Because in ecosystems, small changes at the top often trigger large consequences below low. And Yellowstone was about to prove just how powerful that truth really is. As the wolves began to establish themselves in Yellowstone, the ecosystem did not immediately heal in a smooth or peaceful way. In fact, what followed was a period of intense ecological tension, a silent struggle between predator, prey, and landscape. The elk, once relaxed and dominant in the absence of wolves, quickly adapted. They formed tighter groups, stayed more alert, and began avoiding open valleys where they could be easily targeted. But this adaptation came with consequences of its own. In their effort to survive, elk started pushing deeper into safer zones, areas where young trees and vegetation had already been under pressure for decades. In some regions, overgrazing had become so severe that natural regeneration of willows and aspens had nearly stopped completely. At the same time, wolves were learning Yellowstone just as much as Yellowstone was learning them. Packs had to define territories, compete for resources, and establish dominance in a landscape that was still adjusting to their return. Not all introductions were successful. Some wolves struggled to adapt, and survival was never guaranteed. But the most important conflict was not just between wolves and elk, it was between expectations and reality. For decades, many scientists believed that bringing wolves back would simply reduce elk numbers. What they did not fully anticipate was a deeper behavioral shift, fear itself becoming an ecological force. Elk were no longer just being hunted. They were being reshaped by the constant possibility of predation. This landscape of fear began to change where elk fed, how long they stayed, and which parts of Yellowstone they could safely use. And slowly, without anyone directly planting a seed or rebuilding a forest, vegetation began to respond. Willows started regrowing in protected areas. Aspen shoots appeared where they had been absent for years. And as plant life began to return, another layer of the ecosystem started to awaken: beavers, birds and smaller mammals that depended on those plants for survival. But this transformation was still fragile, because Yellowstone had not yet reached its turning point. And what came next would determine whether this restoration would succeed. or collapse under its own complexity. By the early 2000s, Yellowstone was no longer the same place it had been just a decade earlier, and the evidence of change was becoming impossible to ignore. Where scientists once saw empty, overgrazed riverbanks, they now observed the return of thick willow stands. Aspen groves, once struggling to survive, began showing signs of regeneration. The landscape itself was slowly rebuilding its lost structure. And at the center of this transformation was not a single event, but a chain reaction, one that traced back to the presence of wolves and the behavioral pressure they placed on elk populations. Elk were no longer shaping the land in the same way. Their constant movement, driven by the risk of predation, meant they spent less time in sensitive areas like river valleys. This gave young vegetation the time it needed to grow, stabilize soil, and restore habitats that had been absent for decades. That vegetation change triggered something even more surprising. Beavers, which rely heavily on willow for food and dam construction, began returning to areas they had abandoned long ago. Their dams slowed water flow, created ponds, and altered the physical structure of streams. These new water systems supported fish, amphibians, and a growing diversity of bird species. What began as a predator-prey interaction had now evolved into a full ecological reconstruction. Rivers became more stable. Erosion decreased in several key areas. Entire microhabitats reappeared across the park. Even scavenger species benefited from wolf kills, creating opportunities for ravens, eagles, and smaller carnivores. For the first time in decades, Yellowstone was functioning more like a complete ecosystem. Again, not just a collection of species, but a connected system where each part influenced the others. Yet the most striking realization for scientists was not just that wolves were present again. It was that a relatively small number of animals, acting through natural behavior alone, had triggered changes far beyond what human intervention alone had been able to achieve. The ecosystem was not just recovering, it was reorganizing itself. And in that moment, Yellowstone became one of the most powerful, real-world examples of how deeply a single species can shape an entire landscape. As Yellowstone continued to evolve, scientists gradually stepped back from observing a wolf reintroduction and began recognizing something much larger, a restoration of ecological relationships that had been missing for nearly a century. The wolves themselves did not rebuild forests. They did not engineer rivers or plant trees. Their role was far more indirect, yet profoundly influential. Through hunting, movement, and social behavior, they reshaped the behavior of elk, which in turn allowed vegetation to recover, which then supported a chain of life across multiple levels of the ecosystem. But perhaps the most important lesson from Yellowstone was not just about wolves, it was about balance. For decades, their absence had shown how quickly an ecosystem can drift when a single key species disappears, and their return demonstrated how interconnected nature truly is, where even small behavioral shifts at the top can cascade downward in unexpected ways. By the time researchers published long-term findings, Yellowstone was often described as one of the clearest examples of a trophic cascade ever recorded. Yet even then, scientists continued to debate and refine their understanding, because nature rarely operates in simple linear cause and effect patterns. What remained undeniable, however, was the transformation itself. Forests regrew, rivers stabilized, biodiversity increased, and wolves, once again became a permanent part of the landscape they had been absent from for so long. Today, the story of Yellowstone's wolves is studied not only in wildlife biology, but in ecology classrooms around the world as a reminder that the natural world is not a collection of isolated parts, but a living system of relationships. And in that system, even a single wolf can become a force of change far greater than anyone expected. The return of the wolf did not just change Yellowstone. It helped reveal how Yellowstone was always meant to work. The story of Yellowstone's wolves is more than a wildlife recovery. It is a reminder of how fragile and powerful natural balance can be at the same time. For nearly 70 years, wolves were missing from this ecosystem, and in that absence the landscape slowly shifted in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply significant. When they finally returned, they didn't just reappear as predators, they re-entered a system that had been waiting quietly to respond. And what followed was not instant change, but a gradual unfolding of consequences across generations of plants, animals, and rivers. This is what makes Yellowstone so important in modern ecology. It shows that nature is not built on isolated events, but on connections where every species plays a role, even when that role is not fully understood at first. Today, wolves continue to roam Yellowstone as part of a restored balance. But the story is still being written. Ecosystems are never truly finished. They continue to adapt, shift, and respond to every living force within them. And that leaves us with a simple but powerful question. If the return of one species could help reshape an entire ecosystem, what else might we still be missing from the natural world? This is Wolf Empire. Thanks for watching.